Hi, and welcome to Decoding AQ, helping you to learn the tools, mindsets, and actions to thrive in an ever-changing world. Hi, and welcome to the next episode of Decoding AQ. Today, we have the pleasure of hosting Emily James. She is the Head of Talent Procurement at BP. She's an accomplished HR leader with an impressive track record in all sorts of things HR, with 10 years at BP, little time in the middle with Cisco. And in fact, I met Emily at the World Commerce and Contracting Conference in Malaga early this year. I was leading a session, a keynote on adaptability intelligence, and several VIP workshops for building workforce adaptability. And Emily was part of a breakfast panel with some other inspiring women to discuss inclusivity and diversity. And that sparked quite a deep, unexpected conversation between us and to today's interview. So welcome to the show, Emily.
Thank you, Ross, and thank you for having me. And what I particularly like talking to you, or why I like talking to you, is because the sun is always shining. So here we were in Malaga in Spain, and it was 35 degrees, and it's a balmy 30 degrees today. So
It is.
looking forward to talking to you about.
It is. And we found out that even though we met in Spain, we actually live in the same county here in the UK in
We
Wiltshire,
do, we
which
do.
was
It's very
just
unusual.
fascinating, very unusual. And I think what's interesting and why I wanted to speak to you on the show is that, with multinational organizations, lots of experience, whether that's managing complex situations, different stakeholders, people with good intent and messing up along the way, people who, might not really understand what's appropriate or not, and just your own career and in journey of experience using coaching and mentoring. But I'd like to start off with just what's exciting in your life right now. What are you involved in? What's bringing you energy and joy, Emily?
What's bringing me energy and joy? So I think one of the things, Ross, that I feel is we've got this hot topic at the moment about AI. So everybody's talking about AI, everybody's talking about the impact that technology will have on our workforce. And I think the received wisdom is that, there are upsides to that. So we should start to see technology making us more productive, which then means that we should produce more, which in itself means that we should have more jobs, which gives people more opportunity. Now, that feels like that's quite tempered by this gloomster story of, but we know that transition isn't going to be an equal transition. We know that that's going to take time, and we know that there are going to be people who've already in some way lost who are losing even more, and what impact is that going to have across society? And if you just hold that for a moment, and then you ask me the question, what excites me? I think that there is real opportunity to change that narrative there. And the work that I do here at BP is looking at really different forms of how we work. And so if you take that idea that this big tech revolution and AI revolution is going to transform roles, is it really going to transform all of the role that we do today? So parts of my role are very easy to digitize and to put into a bot. There are parts of my role that will never be able to do that. And that requires some of those kind of, if we like, we call them accelerator skills within our own organization, which is what you also mentioned in your book around storytelling, creativity, building relationships, that the bots will never be able to do for us. So I think there's just, what's exciting about the work here is just this ability, I think, to disrupt some of this gloomster thinking around how that transition is going to play out, and how can we really help people to think differently about it. I think this is sometimes fueled, and I think also you might reference this in your book, by this fallacy that there aren't enough roles for people in this world. So this disruption therefore means that there aren't going to be any roles, which, as someone told me the other day, if you were to take all the job vacancies in the US and you were to put all the job seekers against those same vacancies, you'd still be short by 10 million people. Now, like if you think about, if you break down roles then and start to move skills into that the technology and AI, and then you remove what you believe is more of a human-based skill, and you start to aggregate that in jobs, there's an opportunity here, one for people to get more experience, reskill, but also for us to fill some of those big gaps that all of us are struggling with at the moment. So that is maybe just a starter for us to talk about, but that's what's getting me out of bed this morning.
It's interesting, isn't it? You know, we all have a perspective, right, on something of we can be excited, we can be nervous, we can be, you know, feeling afraid and fear or engaged. And all of these things get mixed up, you know, in a daily life. And it depends whether it's a Wednesday or a Thursday sometimes, you know, to how we see things. And a big part to play in this is the stories that we allow into our lives, right? The media, and, you know, I'm a movie fan. I love movies, love watching documentaries and dramas. And so much of it is very much the doom and gloom aspect. It has been for, you know, many, many years. That's the way that sells things, right? The doom and gloom of these things, it's coming to take over. If you look at any sci-fi film, there's been some kind of technology that is evil and has been pitted against us rather than made us joyful or creative. Or another visual just came into my head of the Wall-E. I don't know if you remember that one, where
Yes.
at the end it was so funny that the humans had so little to do. They were all overweight, they were all just moving around on these, you know, hovering chairs, trying to play tennis or whatever, or somewhere up in space, because there was nothing left for them to do other than just, you know, play. So it comes to a serious point here around, you mentioned roles are shifting in terms of the task makeup. I remember you know, throughout my career, you try and wrap all these different tasks up into some kind of thing, give it a title that ends up being some kind of morphic unicorn that never exists because they need to do 1,000 different things super well, to now the reality that we don't even know what makes up a traditional role title anymore in terms of the tasks and the skills.
Yeah.
So we're in this sort of remodeling transition phase, which you expressed as what an opportunity to change the narrative. So tell me a bit more about that, of what is going on, or what are you seeing that's going on in terms of the structuring of roles and tasks and skills to help us through this transition?
Yeah. So I also reflected on job roles as I was thinking about this podcast, Ross, and I thought you could go into a room of people and ask them what was in the original job spec that they applied for, and you can probably be 99% sure that you get very few hands shooting up to say that it was the job that they performed today. And yet we do seem wedded to this idea of a role and a person, and that is what they need to do. And so I think what's really interesting to me is there's a couple of things that are really changing the dynamic in that. So when we last met, we were both sharing that we were step parents, and I have two stepdaughters who are in their 20s. And they've really been brought up in an environment where everything is on demand. So ask me to do something and I'll do it for you. And this idea that you go into a work environment, whether there is something for you to do or not something for you to do, this kind of this idea of input-based working is really alien to them. So give me work when you need me to do it and tell me for when it will, and I'll get that done for you. So this more kind of like output-based, deliverables-based work is really appealing to them. So I think you're starting to see a push into that coming from a new generation of workers that are coming through into these big companies. I think the other side of that is that we just simply don't have enough people with the requisite skills. I mean, if you take our company, for example, we're moving out of becoming what we call an international oil and gas business into an integrated energy company. And those are new markets. They're new markets we need to, as a society, scale up the solutions that we have in those new markets at a very rapid pace. So this idea then of the linear job role to one person, and that one person having everything that you need in order to perform all of that work, just isn't feasible. And it starts to slow down the pace at which the business is able to operate. So our chief talent officer often says that he's less concerned about the money running out than the skills that we have to achieve the business ambition that we've laid out by 2030. And what that forces us to do is really start to then break down those job roles and understand what are critical skills, how can we spread individuals who have those critical skills across a number of different areas rather than in that linear job role. I think that, coupled with a real surge in the way that people want to work coming through that new generation, is forcing us to look at things. But it's very difficult. It's a difficult transition to make, because we all like to declare what headcount we've got and how efficiently the business is running against that headcount. So it's a real mindset shift across the organisation that needs to be underpinned by an acceptance of people who've gone through big organisations in a very different way. And I think, again, you talk about it in your book, is that ability to see that what's got me to this place so far is not necessarily the key for success in the future, is something that I think we grapple with as you look at leadership teams across these big organisations tending to have more experience and be seasoned individuals. So I think that's also what's exciting, is there's an ability to change the way that we work and make it more skills-based, which gives people, and ironically gives them more exposure to different areas quicker, that allows them to just reskill, upskill, whatever you like to call it, at a greater pace.
It's interesting, isn't it, this phase that we find ourselves in as a society, where no longer was it, okay, get mastery, get really good at the skill, the knowledge area, the knowledge base that you have, and then go and earn from it with a few bits of top up of professional development along the way, right? And that'll come through experience, a few training programs and courses, the odd away day in some office with or without windows, and that'd stand us okay. Whereas now, as you're talking about this almost flux of mobility movement, and it then means, well, what is the playbook anymore? Because if we could define things, if we could define a task, define a standard operating procedure, recur and replicate that, put it into a role, and then it's known, and we can scale it with productivity, efficiency, bit of training, good, we can go for it. Now, if all of that's blurring and it's messy, and it's really messy in that middle, how do we know who to look for, what to look for, what to train them in, and what they'll be doing Monday to Friday versus next month versus next, quarter versus next year? It becomes, again, back to this original comment of so exciting, but also fearful and challenging, of how do you pin something that is always moving? So we all are experiencing this. We're living it in some way, shape or form. We're sticking our heels in, or we're, getting the surfboard out to go, let's go, and maybe a few in the middle. And I'm curious, from a shift and an adaptation point of view that you talked about, less worried about the money running out versus the available skills or how people transition. How might it provide, let's just zoom out for a moment, more social mobility and greater social mobility for us? And then let's come deeper down into perhaps some tasks, some teams, some projects, things that you're seeing or working on.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, because I think for so long, this idea of so to come back to your example, Ross, about technical qualifications were key previously. So on a job description, what you'd probably see is, what functional knowledge did you need to have? What did you need to have experience of? And then, if you recall, right at the bottom of that job spec would be like a paltry 3 bullets on, and these are some soft skills that you might need as well, like communication, influencing, persuading. And I think, to your point about the world now moving so quickly, the functional technical skills get outdated quite very, very rapidly. So I was reflecting before I came onto this podcast about, I started off my career in sourcing and contracting, which was pen and paper, eyeballing each other in a room, knowing the insides out of a standard contract template and what the legalese all meant. Today, I find myself like thinking about how can we get the teams to engage in the content for a platform that is going to be available to our end users to buy catalogues of goods and services from. So very different technical knowledge, but fundamentally then what do you need in terms of those soft skills that we used to see down in the footnotes now become front and center of what we need from our teams in order to drive this. And I've often had reflections on like, where does my success come from? What's responsible for my personal success? And have been caught in this trap of thinking it's everything that I know functionally and everything that I know technically. And through some exploring, it's more about those footnote skills, right? So it's about quickly learning things, the ability to be resilient, the ability to story tell. That's what really drives the success. And so if we think about it, you asked the question about social mobility. Those skills are inherent in people. They can be brought out through different experiences. And some of those barriers to entry that we've seen, for example, in terms of social mobility, which are, getting qualifications means that you need to go to a university, which costs money, which I can't afford, which means I exit early. And then I'm faced with a load of job descriptions from big corporations that are asking me for a degree. And this becomes a really vicious cycle. So we've actually challenged ourselves to remove that from our job descriptions. And I suppose this goes back to the earlier part of our conversation. Think more deeply about the type of person that we want to introduce in our function. And I think I talked a little bit about some of that core set of accelerator skills that we look for from people around the creativity, like the ability to be a good communicator, to storytell. All of those become for us more important than the technical qualifications that sit behind it, which then opens up those opportunities for people who previously haven't been able to get there because the barriers to entry are just so high.
Yeah, it makes me think of, this aspect of where we've marginalized people in various ways, whether it was a university, whether it's a previous thought of what success looked like, and therefore trying to replicate that. And this concept, in product development and things around, time to value. How quickly does somebody try your product, your piece of software, whatever it is, before they get some value from it? Can you do it in the first minute? Is it first hour? Is it 3 months? What is it? And if we think about that for people coming into new roles, whether that's an internal movement or a brand new into this company or team, that time to value. And I just, as I was listening to you, thinking about all those things in the list, and when you're trying to match them up, you're trying to shorten that time to value, right? And based on, they have this university, they've got this training, they've got these things, because their time to value will be shorter, and that value will be more likely to be achieved in this one than this one. Now, what if we don't know what value actually looks like? Because it moves, right? It moves 3 months later, 6 months later. What value looks like that person is required,
Right.
let alone could produce, is different. So therefore, it opens up this huge box of what actually are we hiring for? The ability to provide value for me today, which might be 1 year, 10 year, depending on the role, or the ability for perpetual value creation by their speed of learning, by their willingness to try new things, by some of those things, essential skills, soft skills, communicate with others, get along with people. And I'm interested to flip a question. Actually, before I ask the question, I'll give you an opportunity to respond to any of that if it's triggered something for you, because I do have another question I've got for you.
A couple of things that it's triggered for me, actually. One is, I think, that's a wonderful summary of what's going on. And I think we have what's interesting to me as we consider that is why we think that stamp of education is the only stamp in order to assess whether the person has all of those skills or not. So it feels to me a rather, if I can say and be bold enough to say, a really lazy way of assessing individuals and their ability to help and support and drive some of these big business ambitions that we all have. But just a reflection as well, I think one of the things that we're really conscious about is role modeling. So, it's all very well to open the gates and say we don't need these qualifications anymore. But if people don't feel like these people who are in that camp over there look and behave in the way that I do, I don't feel like I can belong in that camp. There's a lot of work, and I think that's where that's an exciting place to stay in to stay in at the moment. Is how do we truly get inclusive by making these people feel like there is a space, there is definitely a space, they belong in this organization, when perhaps the experience of everyone around them, certainly in the senior leadership positions, is not necessarily their lived experience. And I think we're starting to explore that, but there's a lot more to do in that space before we can really get that equity right.
And it's the full life cycle, right? Not just the people early in, the apprentices, the first in. It's also about the movement from department to department, role to role, from high potential to leader to manage to exec, to all of these parts that we evolve through our journeys, of what do I want to be? And I might want to be something very different in my career, depending on what's going on in my life. Am I single? Am I married? Do I have now children? Do I have, step parent? What are all of these things that evolve in my life that then blend into what part does my work fulfill for me and play in me? But my question that I wanted to come back to was you shared a reflection of, when I look back, what made me successful? What were the things that have led to success? I wonder, what have perhaps been some of the failures, some of the challenges where, wow, I just witnessed something that gave me an incredible learning that was either a first-hand witness, or, you witnessed others doing things that either propelled or closed opportunities and situations throughout your career, because, you've been through different industries, you've had different roles, and what shifted those changes? Because sometimes it's a push, sometimes it's a pull, right? A fail of, I don't fit anymore, I don't see myself in this company or this role, or it's greener over there, I'm going there. It can be a variety of these things. So I'm curious if there's a few things that stand out around observations of where there was fails, epic fails, particularly I'm recalling in my head some of the examples you gave on stage around, diversity, inclusion, language people use, that might have been not even frowned on 20 years ago, but now is totally not appropriate, and people are doing it and failing sometimes even without knowing they're failing and things like that. So I've got a few bits going on in my head. So areas of failure, of learnings, of lessons, and maybe some other pieces of where things to just watch out for that could have been successful before, but now perhaps aren't.
Wonderful. What a big question that is. I think let me answer that question in two parts if I can. So I'd like to respond to the where I have seen others fail question, because I think we've kind of teased the audience with something that I said on stage in Spain. And then let's not let me off the hook either, Ross, and let's say where I failed.
I'll hold you to it. All right.
I will have a highlight because the list is long. So failure to be inclusive, I think one of the things on stage that I spoke about in Spain, which was this idea of misogyny that is still very much alive and well, and that the idea of gender inclusivity comes, I think, in one of two ways. One was very explicit misogyny that I think I shared that one of my team had experienced when she went to a speaking event and had been suffering from a bad cold, was invited up to stage to speak, and a supplier who was there alongside her said, "Oh, it's a shame you have a cold, I won't be able to snog you afterwards." Very explicit misogyny quite shocking that that's still happening in 2024, because that was earlier in this year. And I think that it's brave and it takes courage to call it out, but it feels an obvious one to call out. I think where we start to see failures for us all is where that is happening at a much more subtle level. And I think there's, microaggressions is a good expression that's frequently used. And the second example that I gave was when I was in a meeting with a supplier, and I was being relatively assertive in some of the feedback that I was given. And it just so happened that the previous night I'd gone to see Philippa Gregory talk, who's just written a new book on Usual Women, where she talks about how these women have overcome their experiences throughout the agencies where perhaps they didn't have much agency at the time, and they were often known as emotional or hysterical. And just after that event, this is the day after I've been to that speaking event, in this conversation with that supplier, that same adjective was used about my approach. And it was only really because I'd been in that discussion, because it catches you unawares, that I had put two and two together and called that out. But how do we all call that out? So how can we all be allies and give voice to people who are experiencing that? And that might not be a gender piece, that might be inclusivity on other levels, like racial inclusivity or social mobility. We've talked about other demographics. And I think that failure collectively to not ally as much as we should ally is why we're still talking about diversity and inclusivity in 2024, when it feels like it's been a topic for 10, 20 years, and what more we can do in this space. So I think some of those failures that we all see day to day are still occurring, and there's more that we can do in that space. My failures,
let's frame it to some of your greatest learnings. Greatest learnings,
Thank you.
Wrapped in a failure, because that's really what they are, right? Is they're often, in the moment, highly emotional, very stressful, but on reflection and depending on the lens of excitement or fear, fail or learn, these are where we do learn the most. So think of it in that way as you express it, Emily.
So I think I'm an elder child. And I don't know if you've read a book ever about what pecking order you are born in the family sort of predicates what your personality will be. And there's lots of controversy about the book, but from a personal perspective, they talk about firstborns being people pleasers, very responsible, striving to achieve. And I have to say that I did go through the book and ticked a lot of the boxes for me. So my biggest learning is I have to say no. So if we take back that kind of experience, firstborn child, people pleaser, and reading your book, something that really stuck with me was that we have misconceptions about what has been the reason for our success in the past. And so I got to a really unhealthy place where I was saying yes to everything, because I had associated my success with making everybody happy, doing what was expected of me, hadn't really reflected on that, and got to a point in my career where most people do, where it's just simply not feasible to say yes to everything, nor is it healthy. And being able to create barriers and say no. And there are lots of great articles out there about super successful people who say, this is how you should say no. You should say no 3 times, because then it forces you to really reflect on, is this a yes, and should you do it? But I think it's less about, that was a learning for me, but the process that I had to go through to get to know myself better and actually course correct some of what I had thought. And we talked about it a little bit earlier about what are some of the characteristics that I hold that make me successful, wasn't to do with people pleasing. So I was able to disconnect that and but also be conscious that I think all of us will always fall back into that pattern of helpful thinking from time to time. And it's just being really conscious about you doing it and being able to challenge it, even if it requires you walking around the block with a coffee for 5 minutes and then coming back in and holding something different. So that's been a big learning for me.
It's so fascinating just listening to you and the association we have with certain words, right? And there's always then timing and contextualization of that word. You know, where are we saying it? Are we saying it in one country or another, in one room or another, in one time or another? And things might then mean one thing. We have an intent of something else. We might be interpreted in different ways. We'll also then have a neural net of the experience we've had when we've said no, and whether that has given us then a bias program that no is a bad thing. And it made me think about, how is, what's no's rap? That it's got say no to drugs, good. Say no to an opportunity, bad. Say no to your parents, bad. Say no to a stranger, good. And it's contextual, right, of these things. But underneath it has some sort of visceral, emotional response to us, right? A yes or a no of how do we feel like that. And a no is very much about taking control, and a no in terms of making a decision. And I remember my coach years ago told me, the yeses and nos we can deal with, it's the maybes that kill us. So getting into this sense of a decision to cut off, what do we say no to? And it reminded me of, writings about Steve Jobs. What were the 10 products or 10 projects that he was most proud of? And it was the ones that he said no to. And I think it's incredibly empowering at some point to do it, but it's the way we do it, right? It comes back to another great piece that another mentor of mine said about business. I was struggling with a decision. It was a personnel decision, somebody senior in the company, and I was really struggling. And he said, be ruthless in decision making and humane in execution. And I was the wrong way round. I was being so humane in the decision making, I ended up becoming ruthless in the execution of it, and it all went a bit wrong. And there's some really interesting things as we reflect, as we think, as we read, as we have conversations, and we learn from our experiences around that. And I'm wondering, as you're thinking now of this pressure that we find ourselves under, of pressure of AI technology doing this, pressure of, we've got to change from this view of oil and gas to a inclusive energy company, from this to this, from this to this, whatever it may be, and we never enough time, to just slowing down. And what you see as, how are you navigating that personally? How are you navigating the shift in your own self-expectations, or the expectations the role is going to require of you as you go forwards as part one? How are you dealing it with, from your perspective of navigating that, and then perhaps expand that out from yourself as well?
Yeah, great questions. So a huge amount of pressure to perform. I think additional pressure because the purpose of what we do has such big impact on society. And so not just at a company level do you feel the pressure, but you feel the responsibility to change the way in which we are going to source our energy, and therefore change the consequences that the current way of producing energy has. How do you manage that? So one is, you don't know you're going to be successful in this. Now that's deeply uncomfortable thought to have, because we are programmed to think that this has to be the outcome, and we know that we're going to do it, and it's good to have ambition and it's good to have hope, but you also have to sit with that uncertainty that we may not be successful in this, or we might be successful but not in the way that we had anticipated. And I think that is deeply uncomfortable for us as human beings. And we talked about failures and learning just now. I think what's I personally encourage myself to do, and we're trying to encourage the teams to do, is to really get into that safe space where you can experiment, you can ideate. It's okay if some of that ideation then doesn't work. I mean, I forget the number now, and you'll probably know this, Ross, but how many times did Einstein have a go at the light bulb before we finally got it? And yet we expect ourselves to be right first time. And these are extremely hard challenges and difficult problems to face. So I do think there's permission, which when I reflect on when I started my career, which was all about performance leads to results and results need to be right the first time, I think is a difference that I've had to relearn, that it's okay if you've thought about something, you've been bold enough to try something new, create, and it didn't work, because there's always, to your point, there's always learning in that, and the greatest learning of that. So I think one of the things that I would say is that permission to give myself, which is something different. And then how do you create a safe space with the team, which has to come through trust and confidence that they feel that they can do the same as well. So creating the right environment for them to try things, not be successful, but progressing it always progresses us one step further. And so that really tests you as a leader as well. It's like, how do you create that high psychological safety for your team so that they can be at their best and feel valued, even when something maybe hasn't shown or turned out as they would have expected? And that's difficult.
It's difficult, and I see that as the foundation step, right? To create an environment where we're entering into more uncertainty, we need more experimentation, right? So the known routes for known challenges, fine. In unknown challenges and unknown opportunities, we need more experimentation. So by virtue, yes, we need more experimentation, more permission to do that, and safety to do it in terms of the psychological safety, the team. And I'm curious about the next step, in my view and my opinion, is whilst we can talk the talk, we can provide maybe the environment for that. What are we giving the applause to? And what I mean by that applause, that can be a well done, Emily, good job. It can be an applause by here's your check at the end of the month. It can be an applause by here's some more responsibility, here's a promotion, here's a pay rise, whatever it may be. And I still see so many systems linking the applause, the reward, to the outdated part of the end results, versus how do we link some of that now that the environment is shifting and the experimentation, the not getting a result, having this duality and paradox that we can't continue to get no result, right? To exist, to sustain as a business, we need some result, some value, some outcome that isn't just a learning or a progress. We need impact. We need some value, a sale, a shift, a change, a reduction from coal to, wind, reduction from this, whatever they may be. So it's how do we balance those things in the applause and in the reward of systems? I find perhaps the most challenging part to unlearn and unpick in organizations. I don't know if that's something you've witnessed, you agree, whether you see any progress or got opinions on that, Emily.
So it's a really good point, and I think if you look at our industry right now, Ross, part of the tension is there's the long-term value creation, which speaks to the purpose that I just described about creating clean source of energy for the world, and that has a societal purpose, and we believe that we can make money doing that, balanced out by what you described as the result, which is the short-term investor attention on the share price and whether that's where it needs to be. And so if we think about those two things in the context of the people, because the organization at the end of the day is the people and the ideas and the creativity that they bring, you're right in that we have to always balance those two out, but you have to create this. I'm a firm believer in, if you create the space and time for the long-term value creation, it will take care of the short-term cycles that we see in terms of the investment. And I think there's a small, and I think you've just picked up on an important point, actually, because there's this idea, isn't there, that failure is something different to results. Failure for me is just a step on the path towards the results. And so actually, all things need to be said. It's all the stages.
How are we celebrating? How are we rewarding those? In the same way we might reward, okay, you were looking for 10 sales, you got 5, so we'll pay you commission on the 5. We were looking for this result, you've got 5 ways in not to do it, we'll reward you for the 5 ways of not doing it. In that kind of similar, simple scenario of these things, it's easy to sort of conceptualize, hard to put into practice, and hard to figure out, because you don't know whether it was 10 before you get to the one, or 10,000 before you get to the one that will do it. And not only are we trying to shift for gain, we're also trying to shift to avoid. So it might be regulatory things, it might be then taxations for failure of doing something, particularly in the industry that you're involved in, that not doing enough to meet certain planetary targets, country targets, global targets that we're working on, that there are taxations and penalties for not being able to do this, because we recognize the impact if we don't, the consequences if we don't. And it's perhaps similar, if we pull it back now as we come to the final sort of phase of the interview, is around an individual and their play to win versus play to protect. What am I avoiding? What am I looking to gain? And these footnotes, as you talked about earlier, of soft skills, to now are they promoted? How and what am I working on? What am I developing? What am I training? What am I building within my own skills? And what is the responsibility then of leaders to give space, to model, for companies to invest in, that, between build, borrow, and buy, talent, in that process of what responsibility they're taking to ensure that the right behaviors, the right attitudes, right skills are there for us in this evolving, fast-paced world. And perhaps just finishing off some thoughts around, are there any initiatives that are going on that you're seeing in other organizations with some of your peers, or even within BP, that are working towards that, of providing space and investing space to ensure that there is mobility, there is training, there is development, that's not here's an LMS, here's some videos, go fill your boots, nobody blooming does it, to the workshops that people go, well done, and then go back to life and work afterwards. Is this just in time, this need to adapt, this need to learn differently? What's your experience going on in that?
Yeah, I mean, great, all great, a lot in that, and all great questions. And I think, to your point, you get the certificate and then you never look at it again, right? And it's in the dusty bottom shelf of your drawer set. So what we've been trying to do is, as an organization, since we set up this ambition to move to an integrated energy company, we actually didn't put people's roles in their job descriptions post this change. So a period of strong feedback from the teams, because people feel comfort in that. They want to know where they belong. People like the labels because it gives them a level of, I know who I am, I know where I am within the organization, and I know what I do. But to your point, that plays to protect as well, because I'm going to shore up against my role, then I'm going to think about what the next role is and what I need to not to do in order to get that next role. So we actually collapsed it, moved the job titles out, started to work in this agile way of going where the work was, the flow to work in terms of talent. Now, that is I won't say that it was a smooth transition for people, But that was 2020. So 2021 is when we stood it up and we said, right, we'll see what the business need is. We'll see what projects are. We're going to look back and see what skills you've got. So you may have done this once in your career, or you may be interested in it and you want to go and learn about it. And you'll swarm around that piece of work for a period of time, stand down, and then mobilize and move into another space. And so what that really prompted was people to think about, like, what skills do I need for that piece of work? What am I passionate about? What am I interested in? Where do I want to go next? Not in the context of roles, but in the context of where they thought they could deliver value for the organization. Now, that's really driving the development. And then what you just described as some of the tools that will help you in terms of that development, the training courses, then we're selected by those individuals to support them to do the work, rather than it being a top-down approach of, this is what I think you might be interested in. Well, they're not really at all. And then I feel like I have to do it. This was like more of a pull than a push from the organization. And so that's what we're trying to pilot. And I think that then you talked about uncertainty. Well, we've got uncertainty in where the business will go next. I mean, a lot of these new markets that we're standing up and these new energy products are very, very immature. So some will be successful, some won't. So as our people, we can't be focused in that role-based, that functional. We have to broaden and really build some of those core muscles that we were talking about earlier in the call. And that's what some of that agile ways of working promotes across the teams.
I find that fascinating, just this different way of how do you allocate resource and talent, right? Against projects, against different ways, and coming out of predefined labels and boxes, which gives, yes, security and a great response to, so what do you do, Emily? And you kind of, well, I know. Well, and it's totally different way of thinking, right? So any kind of big shift like that will have its own challenges. And, you're a few years into that. Did you say it was 2021 was that big
3 years in? 3 years in.
I'm conscious of our time, not only in the recording, but also for the listeners. But if I may, have you got another 5 minutes or so? Because I'd like to just dig into this a little bit more if you do.
Yes, I do have 5 more minutes.
All right.
We're good to go.
So if somebody's listening to that and thinking, that sounds really interesting, that sounds something that might suit our organizational challenge that we're facing, other than getting in touch and having deeper conversations, what would be a couple of highlight tips for them to think about if they are, leading some new HR strategies in their role, to look at the organizational design, organizational structure, that we're excited by that, of a couple of key highlights of things to consider, things to be aware of 3 years down the line of that experiment?
Yeah. So I think first thing, Ross, is how do you give people security in that environment? So we had come out of a very public restructuring at that point in time. And now I say to someone, I'm going to strip any kind of role title that gives you any security out of your CV. That makes them feel extremely vulnerable and like there's something going on that's behind the scenes. So I encourage folks to really describe the why there. And I think the why is broader than just our company. I think the why is, this is how the world of work is going to happen in the future. So what I'm equipping you with is like the skills and also the characteristics, or like helping you develop those characteristics that will now position you for success in whatever you're going to do. So I think really spending some time with people on the why. I think in support of that, in everything, you've got early adopters and then you've got the laggards in this big change curve that you're going through. So if you can do some peer role modeling, we found that extremely powerful to help people understand what success looked like for them. So the other thing that we typically got was to come back to your question about reward, right? If I've got one role, I've got a set of performance results that I need to achieve by end of year, and then I get my, my check in the post. well, hang on a minute, I've got all of these projects going on, I'm part of a squad. How are you going to reward me for that? And so getting ahead of some of that as well. So I would say trust, building trust through the why and what the why means for them in its in its broadest context, not just at the organizational level. I think peer modeling is super important in this space as well. And thirdly is just think deeply about recognition and reward in this type of environment. And we've just described that is something new for a lot of HR professionals at the moment.
Yeah, that's really valuable. Was there any sort of more human side in terms of coaching? So you talked about peer modeling and those kind of things. Was there any support from a coaching perspective to help people through those transitions of crisis of identity, of feeling lack of value or clarity in that disruption phase? Was that something that you put in? If you didn't, is it something you think may be helpful for others to think about? What's your view just about coaching? And then I'll hit you with my last question, which I ask everybody at the end, Emily.
Cool. So comes back down to identity on the coaching piece. So what does give you identity? And a lot of people felt that it was the role title that gave them identity. And then keep in mind as well, so we took the role titles out, but we also changed the grading system at the same time. So it's the grades being taken from you, the titles being taken from you. So what? I'm no longer a VP in this space delivering this. So who am I? And so I think that how does that show up differently? Well, that shows that we had a number of what we called like forward framing skills that people got assessed at. So sharing with them how we felt they, were performing against those forward framing skills, allowing them to explore that, to feel proud of that. That was really what their identity was about, rather than, and then, you would play it back to them and say, I think you've got mastery in communication, influencing. I think your storytelling is wonderful. So what actually does that piece of paper with one line on it mean? Like, why is it that you feel more attached to that as opposed to all these wonderful things that we've just described that you can own and develop and be successful in? And I think that's super important to spend some time in that space in coaching people and getting them comfortable with it.
Yeah, and I think it's the self-work, isn't it? The self-confidence in that versus the validation of others' understanding. Well, I don't get what that means, Emily. I know what a VP means, says the rest of the world.
Right.
You might be comfortable, but is the rest of the world comfortable? And that stems from self first, right? Do I
Yeah, I
have
mean,
worth?
what am
And
I going to put on LinkedIn?
yeah.
I even had that, Ross. I had
Wow,
that. Crikey, you're going to make me change it on LinkedIn. So
isn't it?
yes, so
Wow.
that,
Yeah, it
that
is.
public validation,
And it's very important for many, right?
important. Yeah.
Comes back to your point about the pecking order, right? Where are
Yes.
we born, and how does that model that I might be totally comfortable with me and who I am, but I also need others to see me in a certain way as a small part, or for others as a big part of what makes me, get up, smile, and feel fulfilled. So my last question for you, I ask everybody, and it's around curiosity, and it's when was the last time you did something for the first time? And what was it?
We should have had this podcast last month. And the reason for that was because, so we've delayed it because for the first time I walked 100 kilometers back to back in 2 days. And my feet were in absolute shreds. And I think I had a chest infection, which stopped me from doing it. So that's the crikey, why would you do it summary of events. But we just talked a whole heap about some of these life skills that all of us are going to need. And I think we've been talking about them in the context of work, but I just think they're just generally wonderful life skills. And if anything is going to teach you resilience, as I explained to somebody, I think running, I'm a runner as well, and I've done half marathons. You hit the wall once. On a 100-kilometer run, you hit the wall, or walk, you hit the wall about 16 times. And so it was just I said the physical pain is quite immaterial with the mental battle that's going on. And in terms of, and again, I'll come back to your book, Ross, because I found that fascinating.
Thank you for reading it. By the way, you've referenced it so
Reframing.
much. I really
It's
appreciate that.
wonderful. It's the reframing and reframing of I have choice. I am choosing to do this. This is not being done to me. And so I am going to choose to have a positive experience doing it. So not yet signed up to the next one, but absolutely a really enriching experience.
Love it. Well, Emily, and also a first podcast as well.
Yes, first podcast.
Awesome work. I'm glad that you could break your podcast debut with me. I feel honored. I can see many a podcast in your future, should you choose to do so.
Thank you.
It's been an absolute pleasure to learn more about you, how you see the world, and I've certainly got a few things in my own thoughts and notes that I'm going to reflect on. I hope some of our listeners feel the same. If they're inspired to get into touch, what's the best way they can get in touch with you, Emily?
Either LinkedIn, or if they want to drop me a note, it's just Emily James or emily.james@bp.com, and we'd love to hear from people.
Beautiful. Thank you, Emily. It's been an absolute
Ross.
pleasure.
Likewise. Thank you very much. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Do you have the level of adaptability to survive and thrive the rapid changes ahead? Has your resilience got more comeback than a yo-yo? Do you have the ability to unlearn in order to reskill, upskill and break through? Find out today and uncover your adaptability profile and score, your AQ. Visit AQai.io to gain your personalised report across 15 scientifically validated dimensions of adaptability. For a limited time, enter code PODCAST65 for a complimentary AQME assessment. AQai, transforming the way people, teams and organisations navigate change. Thank you for listening to this episode of Decoding AQ. Please make sure you subscribe on your favourite podcast directory, and we'd love to hear your feedback. Please do leave a review and be sure to tune in next time for more insights from our amazing guests.